Welcome to Late Night Calm. When your father died, the Lord took your best cow, not the worst one, not a fair share, not whatever you could spare after the burying. The best one, the strongest ox in the byre, the one you had fed through the lean months, the one whose pulling kept your strips of field from going to weed. He died in the night, your father, the way fathers do, with the candle low and the breath gone shallow, and before the ground had even thawed enough to take him, a man came from the manor. He came not to mourn, he came to choose. He walked into the small, dark space where your animals stood, breathing their warm breath into the cold. And he ran his hand along their backs, and he picked the best one, and he led it away. And there was nothing you could do, because that was the law. That was simply how it worked. The death of the head of the household was not only a grief, it was a payment that fell due. They called it virgate. Stay with me tonight, because we are going to walk all the way up from here, from this cold byre, from this taken cow, all the way up the ladder of a whole medieval kingdom, rung by patient rung, until we are standing beside the king himself and his treasury full of counters. And what I want you to feel as we climb is not anger and not pity, just the slow, strange shape of how it all fit together. There is no rush. Let your eyes go soft. Let the day you have just finished slide off your shoulders and pool somewhere on the floor where you do not have to look at it. You do not have to follow every thread. You can drift off halfway up the ladder and you will lose nothing, because the climb itself is the gift, and it will still be here, slow and quiet whenever you come back. So, settle in, and before we begin in earnest, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. Leave it in the comments if you feel like it. A town, a country, just a word. It is a small thing, but it makes this quiet room feel a little less empty. And if you are new here, if you have only just wandered in, you might press the subscribe button so the next slow story finds its way to you when you need it. There. That is all the bustle there will be tonight. From here on, it is only the calm and the long walk upward, and your breath going slower with each step. Now, back to the byre, and the man leading your best cow away, and what it actually meant to be the kind of person who could not stop him. You were a serf, a villain, the records would have called you, and that word is worth holding in your mouth for a moment, because it is the bottom rung, and almost everything above it is built on the labour of people exactly like you. When the great survey of England was made, the one we call the Domesday Book, the clerks who rode from manor to manor counting everything that could be counted, wrote down the villani as the largest single class of all, more of you than anyone else. The broad base of the whole pyramid. You were, in the cool, dry phrase of the old lawyers, adscriptus glebae, bound to the soil, tied to the land. And here is the thing that people rarely understand about what that meant, the thing that makes the whole picture stranger and gentler and crueler all at once. You did not belong to the Lord the way a horse belongs to a rider. You were not a slave who could be bought and sold off on his own, dragged to a market and handed to a stranger for coin. No, you were tied to the land, and that is a very particular kind of binding. It meant that when the manor itself changed hands, when the old lord died or sold it or passed it to a son, you went with it. You came as part of the place, the way the trees came, the way the mill and the mill pond and the boundary stones came. A new lord inherited the fields and the woods and the people on them all together in one transfer as one estate. So you were unfree, yes, unfree relative to your lord. He could call on your labour, fine you for your life events, forbid you to wander off without permission. But here is the strange comfort buried inside it, the thing that made your life not the life of a slave, but the life of a serf. You were free relative to the rest of the world. A stranger could not simply walk up and seize you. Another lord could not come and take you for his own fields. You were held, but you were held by one set of hands, and only that one set, and against everyone else in the wide world, those same hands were, in a rough and self-interested way, a kind of shelter. You belonged to a place, and the place belonged to a man, and that man, whatever else he was, had a powerful reason to keep you where you were, and breathing, because you were valuable. That is the cold heart of it. Every fine, every due, every named payment that fell on you across the seasons of your life made a kind of brutal sense the moment you saw it from the manor house looking down instead of from the buyer looking up. You were a labourer. You were the thing that turned the Lord's land into bread and silver. And so the Lord built a whole quiet machinery of payments designed to capture the value of you at every moment when that value might leak away. This is the part that I want you to really see lying there in the dark, because nothing else in the whole climb is quite so picturable. The medieval serf paid for the simple act of living his life. Not in one tax, paid once a year, the way we might imagine it. No, the fines were tied to the events themselves. They were tied to the very turning points of a human life, the births and the marriages and the deaths, the moments that ought to belong to a family and to no one else. Those were exactly the moments the Lord's hand reached in. We have already seen Harriet, the death due, the best be surrendered when the tenant died. Picture its mirror image at the other end of life's middle, the wedding. When you wished to marry off your daughter, you paid a fine for the privilege. They called it multure. And the logic of it, once you see it, is chilling in its tidiness. Your daughter was a future labourer, or the mother of future labourers, all of them belonging to the manor she was born on. Marry her to a man on the same estate and the Lord lost little, but marry her off the manor, send her away to another lord's land, and you had taken a worker out of the machine. So the fine rose accordingly. You were not really paying for a wedding. You were buying back, at the Lord's price, a sliver of your own child's freedom to leave. And it went on, this taxing of the private and the human. There was lerewhite, a fine levied on a woman for fornication, for a child conceived outside marriage, the Lord reaching even into the bedroom and the bearing of children, and finding, thereto, something he could charge for. There was chevage, a fee you paid for permission to go and live off the manor at all, an annual rent on your own absence, the price of being allowed to be elsewhere while still belonging here. And over the top of all of it sat tallage, the broadest and most arbitrary of them, a tax the Lord could simply levy at will. Not fixed by custom, not capped by any agreement you could point to, but taken because he had decided to take it. Tallage at the Lord's pleasure. You did not negotiate it. You found out what it was, and you paid. I want you to hold all of those names loosely, the way you would hold a handful of small smooth stones: Harriet, Merchet, lerewhite, chevage, tallage. You do not need to memorize them. They will drift past again, but feel the shape they make together, the way they ring the whole of a life, from the bed where children were got to the bed where the old man finally died, with a little fence of fines: birth, marriage, movement, death. Each one a gate, each gate with a keeper, each keeper with his hand out. And none of this was the labour yet. None of this was the actual work you owed. The fines were the events. The work was the everyday. Because the deepest obligation of the serf, the one that filled the ordinary weeks and shaped the ordinary mornings, was labour. Not money at the bottom of the ladder. Money would come to matter more and more as you climbed, but down here, at the broad base, what you owed was sweat, your body, your time. They called it week work, and the name tells you almost everything. So many days every single week you were required to go and work, not your own land but the Lord's. Now here is something you have to understand about the shape of a manor to feel the weight of this. The Lord's land was not the whole of it. The manor was divided. Part of it, often the best part, the Lord kept for himself and worked directly for his own profit. That portion had a name. They called it the domain. The domain was the Lord's personal field, his private breadbasket, the land whose entire harvest went straight into his barns and never touched your table. And the domain could not work itself. It needed hands, it needed your hands. So 2 or 3 days of every week, the better part of half your working time, you laid down your own tools on your own strips and you walked to the Lord's fields and you labored there for nothing. No wage, no share of what you grew. It was simply owed. You plowed his furrows, you sowed his seed, you weeded his rows, you carted his harvest, and you did it because you were a villain, and that was the rent your body paid for the right to scratch a living from the strips you were allowed to call, loosely, your own. 2 days, 3 days, every week, all the turning year. And then, when the year reached its great pinch points, when the corn stood ripe and golden, and the whole future of everyone depended on getting it in before the weather broke, the demand grew heavier still. At harvest, the Lord could summon not just his usual days, but extra ones, special days. The whole village called out together to bring in his crop first. They called these boon days, boon work. The word sounds almost kindly, a boon, a favour, and sometimes the Lord softened it with a little ale and bread, a meal in the field to take the edge off the compulsion. But to make no mistake what it was, at the very moment your own ripe corn stood waiting in your own strips, needing you most, you could be marched off to bring in his first. Your harvest waited while you saved his. That was boon work. That was the bottom of the ladder at its busiest hour. So that was your time. Divided and owed, that was your life events, fenced and fined. And you might think, surely the food you grew, the grain you sweated for on your own strips, surely that at least was yours to do with as you pleased. You grew the wheat. You carried it home. You would grind it into flour and you would have your bread. And here is where the Lord's hand reaches into even that, into the very loaf on your table, in a way so quietly total that when you finally see it, you understand the whole machine. You were forbidden by law to grind your own grain at home. Sit with that a moment. You grew the corn. You owned, in whatever loose sense you owned anything, the actual grain, and yet you were not permitted to turn it into flour by your own hand in your own house with a simple stone. Why? Because the Lord owned the mill. And not just owned it, but held a monopoly on it, a binding compulsion that every soul on the manor must bring their grain to his mill and grind it there and nowhere else. These compulsory monopolies had a name, the banalities, and the mill was the heart of them. There was the Lord's oven too, where you were compelled to bake, and, in the wine country, the Lord's winepress, where you were compelled to press. But the mill was the one that touched every single household, because everyone ate bread, and bread began as grain, and grain became flour only at the mill. And the miller did not grind for free. He took his cut directly out of your grain, a portion of the flour itself, a fee paid in kind that they called the multure. You handed over a sack of corn and you walked away with less flour than that corn should have made. The difference vanished into the miller's bin and, behind him, into the Lord's profit. Every loaf you ever ate had been quietly taxed before it was even dough. Now you might think, well, I will simply grind a little at home, just enough for my own family. A handstone, a quern, 2 flat stones, the oldest tool in the world for turning grain to meal. People had ground their own grain that way since before anyone could remember. What harm could it be? The harm to the Lord was that it leaked his profit. Every household quern was a household not paying multure. And so the lords moved against the querns with a thoroughness that tells you exactly how much money flowed through that monopoly. There is a story, a true one, kept in the Chronicles, from the great abbey of St. Albans, where the abbot was the lord and the townsfolk were his tenants. The abbot's men went through the houses and seized the hand querns, the people's own private grinding stones, and confiscated them. And then, in an act of such pointed humiliation that it has echoed down the centuries, the abbot had the seized querns set into the floor of his own house, paved into the stone underfoot, so that he and his guests walked every day on the broken means by which the people had tried to feed themselves outside his mill. The very stones of independence turned into a doorstep for the powerful to wipe their feet on. The people did not forget. Stones in a floor are patient. And many years later, in the great rising of the common people, in the year 1381, when the long anger of the bottom of the ladder finally boiled up over the whole land, the townsfolk of St. Albans came back. And among all the things they demanded and all the wrongs they tried to undo, they remembered the querns. They went into the abbot's house and they tore up the paving, and they dug out the old confiscated stones, and they broke them into pieces and shared the fragments out among themselves, each carrying away a shard the way you might share out a holy relic, a token of a grievance held for a lifetime, and finally, for one wild moment, answered. That is how deep the matter of who may grind grain ran. People remembered it for a generation and dug up the floor. So this was your life at the bottom, bound to the soil and transferred with it like a tree or a fence post, free against all the world but unfree against the one man above you, paying with your best beast when your father died, paying to marry your daughter, paying for permission to leave, paying a tax your lord could set simply because he wished to, giving 2 or 3 days of every week to fields whose every grain went to his barns, and giving extra days at harvest while your own corn waited, forbidden even to grind your own grain at home, compelled to the Lord's mill, taxed in the very flour of your bread, and shamed if you tried to step outside the machine. It sounds laid out like that, like a thing you could never escape, a binding so complete, reaching from the bed to the grave to the loaf on the table, that a person born into it would simply die in it, and their children after them, world without end. And for most, that is exactly what happened. Most serfs were born villains and died villains and lie now in unmarked ground beneath fields that have been ploughed 1,000 times since. But not all of them, because woven into this whole tight web there was in fact a thread that led out, a single, specific, almost magical way that a serf could shed his bondage and walk out the far side a free man. It was not rebellion, it was not running into the forest, it was something quieter and stranger than that, written into the customs of the towns, and it turned on nothing more than air and patience and a very particular length of time. They had a saying for it in the German lands and echoed across the English ones too. Stadtluft, macht, frei. Town air makes you free. And it meant something almost literal. The walls of a chartered town were, in a way no peasant could fully explain, but every peasant half believed, a kind of boundary across which the Lord's reaching hand could not easily follow. Slip inside those walls, live there, work there, breathe that town air. And if you could stay, unreclaimed, unfound for a certain length of time, then the bondage that had held you from birth would simply dissolve like frost in the morning sun, and you would step back out into the world a different kind of person entirely. But there was a catch in it, a condition, a specific span you had to survive inside those walls before the law would close over your old life and seal you free. Town air could make you free, yes, but only if you lasted exactly long enough, and not a day less. And to understand how long that was, and what waited for the freed man on the far side of it, we have to leave the byre and the domain and the Lord's mill behind, and climb up to the very next rung of the ladder, to the peasant who was not bound at all, the one who already paid in coin instead of sweat, and walked the lanes of the manor a free man while you bent your back on the Lord's fields. Because the door out of serfdom opened, when it opened at all, onto a life that was only one careful step higher, and yet a whole world apart. Welcome to late night, calm. Settle in. Let the room go quiet around you, and let the centuries open up slow. Tonight, we are going down, all the way down, to the bottom of a world that no longer exists, to stand where you would most likely have stood had you been born into it. Not in a castle, not on a horse. In the mud of an open field, on a morning 1,000 years gone, watching a man you have never met walk up the lane to take your best cow, because that is where this begins, with a death and a debt that came due the very instant the death arrived. Picture it. Your father has died in the night. The household is still soft with grief, the candle not yet guttered, the body not yet cold under its cloth. And before the day is fully up, before anyone has so much as dug the grave, the Lord's man is at the door. He is not there to mourn, he is there to collect. He walks past you into the byre, and he looks over the animals with the calm eye of a man taking what is already his, and he leads away the best beast you own. The finest cow, the strongest ox, the single most valuable living thing your family possessed. They called it heriot, a death tax paid not in coin but in livestock, owed to the Lord the moment the head of a household died. The logic of it was cold and simple. You had held that land and those beasts from him, and now that you were dead, he took a piece back, the choicest piece, as the price of your son being allowed to go on holding what was left. Your father's death was, to the man up the hill, a transaction, and the first thing the new generation learned, standing in that emptied byre, was that even dying was something you owed for. That was your life at the bottom. So tell me, before we go deeper, where in the world are you listening from tonight? I find I genuinely like to know, lying here imagining all the dark rooms this voice drifts into. And if you are new here, and you would like more of these slow walks into the buried past, you might quietly subscribe and let them find you on the nights you cannot sleep. There is no hurry. There never is here. Because tonight we are going to do something unhurried and strange. We are going to climb, rung by rung, from the mud to the crown, and at every level we are going to stop and ask the same 3 quiet questions. What was your daily life? What did you owe? And could you ever have gotten out? Stay as long as you can. Drift whenever you like. The ladder will still be here. So, back to the bottom rung where you began, where most people who ever lived began. You were a villain, a serf, and the word that defined you was not, as you might think, slavery. It was something subtler and stranger than that. The lawyers had a phrase for it, 3 Latin words, adscriptus, glebae, bound to the soil. You were tied to the land itself, the way a tree is tied to the ground it grows in, and when the manor was sold or inherited or handed down to some heir you would never meet, you went with it. You were listed. You were counted In the great survey the Normans made of the whole kingdom, the Domesday Book, you and people like you appear as the villani, the largest single class of human beings in England, written down beside the ploughs and the pasture as part of the value of the place. And here is the strange double edge of it, the thing worth turning over slowly in the dark. You were unfree, yes, but only in one direction. Unfree relative to your lord, who could bind you, fine you, command your labor. But free relative to the rest of the world. A stranger could not simply ride up and seize you. Another lord could not take you. You belonged to one man and one manor, and against everyone else that belonging was almost a kind of shelter. You were not a slave to be bought and sold off the land. You were the land, and the land could not be carried away. But the land asked a great deal of you in return, and it asked in named, specific ways, each with its own old word, each one a small toll gate set across the ordinary passages of a life. When your father died, the Lord took the cow, that was Heriot, and the other gates stood waiting all through your years. When you wished to marry off your daughter, especially to a man on another manor, you paid a fine for the privilege. Multure, they called it, because a daughter who married away was a future worker walking out of the Lord's holding, a pair of hands and a womb full of children, leaving his fields for someone else's, and he wanted paying for the loss. Your daughter's happiness, her wedding, the simplest hope a parent carries, came with a line on the Lord's account roll. If a woman of the manor lay with a man outside of marriage, there was a fine for that too. Learwhite levied on her body and her conduct, the Lord reaching even into the bedchamber to find something to charge for. If you wanted to go and live somewhere off the manor to try your fortune elsewhere while still belonging here, you paid for the permission. Chevage, an annual fee simply to breathe air your lord did not own, a rent on your own absence. And over all of it hung the worst one, the one with no fixed price at all, tallage, a tax the lord could levy, in the old phrase, at will, when he wanted, as much as he judged he could take. There was no negotiating it, no set sum to plan around, just the knowledge that whatever you managed to scrape together and set aside could be reached for, more or less, whenever the man up the hill decided he had need. So your life was hedged on every side by these small named prices: birth, marriage, love, movement, death, each one a toll, each one a word. And those were only the payments in coin and kind. The payments in sweat were heavier still, because you did not only owe the Lord money, you owed him your days, your back, your hands. The arrangement at the heart of serfdom was labour, raw and unpaid, given over to the Lord's own portion of the manor, the part he kept for himself, which they called the domain. 2 days a week, often 3, you walked off your own strips of land and onto his, and you worked his soil for nothing. Week work, it was called, the steady, grinding tithe of your time. Plough his fields, sow his seed, tend his crops while your own waited. And then, at the great hinges of the farming year, when the harvest stood ripe and every hour mattered and the weather might turn, the demand swelled. The whole village was summoned. Boon work, those extra days were called, the boon days, when you and everyone you knew bent together over the Lord's harvest, racing the rain to get his grain in before you were finally let loose to save your own. 2 or 3 days of every week gone. The strongest part of you given upward to the man whose cow it would be when you died. And then, perhaps strangest of all, to our modern ears, there was the matter of the grain itself, and the small stone you were forbidden to own. You grew the grain, you reaped it, threshed it, carried it home. It was, by any natural reckoning, yours, but you were not permitted to turn it into flour under your own roof. By law, by the iron custom of the manor, you could not grind your own grain at home. You were compelled, every household of you, to carry your sack to the Lord's mill, the great watermill turning on the stream that he owned, and there the miller took his cut of your flour as the price of the grinding. The multure, that portion was called, a tax on bread itself, skimmed off the top of the one thing standing between your family and hunger. This whole web of monopoly had a name, the banalités. The Lord's mill you must grind at. The Lord's oven you must bake in the wine country, the Lord's press you must use, the most ordinary acts of feeding yourself, funneled through machines he owned, each one taking its toll on the way through. And the Lords enforced it with a hardness that tells you exactly how much it mattered to them. The peasants naturally resisted. Many a household kept a small hand quern, 2 round stones you could turn by hand to grind a little grain in secret, in defiance of the rule, to keep just a sliver of their own bread for themselves, and when the lords found these querns, they took them. At St. Albans, under the abbot, who held that great house, the seized hand querns were not merely confiscated. They were carried in, and they were set into the floor of the abbot's own building, paved into the stone underfoot. A deliberate humiliation, a thing the monks and the abbot would walk across every single day. There is your stubbornness set beneath our feet. Grind your grain at home now. Hold that image as you drift, those stones in the floor, because they did not stay there forever. They waited, mortared into the abbot's pavement for the better part of a lifetime, until a year came when the people at the bottom of this whole ladder rose up in their fury. And among everything else they did, the men of St. Albans came into that hall and tore those querns up out of the floor, prizing free the very stones that had been laid down to shame their grandfathers. But that rising and the long-burning anger that lit it is a fire much further up our climb, and we are not there yet. Not nearly. We are still here, at the bottom, in the byre and the mill yard, where a life was measured out in days owed, and beasts surrendered, and flour skimmed. And yet, even here, in this most bound of all conditions, there was a door. Faint, narrow, half-rumoured, but real. One way out of the whole arrangement, requiring neither rebellion nor coin, only nerve and distance and time. A man born a serf, fixed to the soil like the chalk under the fields, could, if he played it exactly right, walk free of all of it, not by fighting, not by buying his way out, but simply by reaching the walls of the towns, and it turned on nothing more than air and patience and a very particular length of time. The door had a rule. One rule, precisely worded, harder in practice than it sounds in the telling, but it was real, and people knew of it, and some of them walked toward it through the cold and the mud and the dark of early winter, counting the days. A serf who reached the walls of a chartered town and remained there, unclaimed by his lord, for a year and a day, would, by the custom of many of those towns, be considered free. Town air makes you free. That is the rough translation of the old German phrase Stadtluft, macht, frei. And if it sounds like a proverb, it is also a statement of something that actually happened, in enough places and enough centuries that it had weight. The walls of the town were a kind of magic circle, not mystical but legal, and the law said that after a year and a day you had left the other jurisdiction behind. Why a year and a day? The extra day was the legal tradition's way of making certain. A year alone might mean you had arrived on the last morning of the year and left before full completion. A year and a day was unambiguous. You could count it, you could prove it. And that precision mattered because a lord who suspected a serf had fled to the nearest town had a year to come and find him and drag him back, before the right expired. So the serf in the town kept quiet. He found work. He did not call attention to himself. He waited through seasons, watching the calendar, and if he survived the Lord's notice for long enough, the law shifted beneath his feet, and he stepped onto firmer ground. It was not simple. Lords did search. Some sent agents, and a serf, caught and returned before the year was up, faced whatever punishment his lord cared to impose. But the rule existed, and it was known, and it is important to hold that alongside everything else you have heard about the bound, locked, airless life at the bottom of this ladder. Even there, even in the most constrained condition the medieval countryside could offer a human being, there was a crack in the wall. There was the faint outline of a door. And beyond it, in the smoky, crowded noise of the town, was something recognizably different. That difference has a name. It has several names, in fact, layered over each other like the strata in a clay bank. But before the town, there was another kind of life that occupied the territory between the bound serf and the chartered burgess. A life that many people in the medieval countryside actually led, a life with considerably more room to move than the villains without yet being fully free of the land's demands. This is the life of the free peasant, the freeholder, the man who paid rent rather than owing blood and sweat, and his position on the ladder is both more comfortable and more complicated than the bare pyramid suggests. The crucial distinction, the thing that separated his sleep from the serfs, was this: he did not owe labor, he owed money. That sounds simple, it was not trivial. The difference between a man who must appear on the Lord's domain 2 days a week and drag a plough through someone else's field, and a man who hands over a fixed sum at Michaelmas and gets on with his own life, is the difference between owning your time and not owning it. The free peasant, called by different names in different places and periods, the sokeman in the eastern counties where the Danelaw had softened the manorial grip, the libere tenens in the Latin of the court records, the censier in the French-influenced documents, the free tenant in the plain English of the manor rolls, this man held his land in exchange for a payment called the cens or the quitron, a fixed, predictable sum. Not arbitrary, not at the Lord's will, paid on set days, often twice a year, and once paid, the obligation was discharged. His time was his own. And there was something else, something that the serf, for all the small dignities the law allowed him, did not have. The free tenant could take his grievances to the royal courts, not just the manor court where the Lord Steward sat in judgment, and the outcome was weighted from the start, but to the king's courts, to the assizes, where a royal judge rode the circuits and administered something closer to even-handed law. This mattered in ways that went far beyond any single dispute. It meant that the free tenant's tenure was legally protected in a way the serf's was not, that his land could not simply be taken at the Lord's pleasure, that he had recourse, that he existed, in the eyes of the Crown's law, as a full person with enforceable rights. A serf had customary rights, recorded in the manor rolls, protected by the customs of the estate. A free tenant had something harder, something carved into the common law of England, and it made a practical difference in a world where the ability to sue was one of the fundamental markers of a free human being. The free tenant could also leave. He could sell or sublet his holding within certain constraints, and he could simply go, and his lord could not chase him down and drag him back. That freedom of movement, so elementary it barely seems worth stating, was in fact one of the structural bedrock differences between servile and free tenure, and whole village communities in the centuries after the Norman conquest sorted themselves along this line, not always cleanly, not always stably, but with real and felt consequences for every family that lived inside the arrangement. Now, free tenure itself came in grades. The medieval mind loved gradation, loved the careful naming of distinctions that a flatter era might have collapsed into a single category. There were different ways to hold land freely, and they had different characters, different textures, different sets of obligations attached. The broadest and lightest was called scutage. Land held in scutage was land held for a money rent or for small, fixed, defined services, not military service in the full feudal sense, and not the degrading labor dues of the serf. It was the tenure of the industrious middling peasant, of the moderately prosperous farmer, of the man who had got far enough ahead of pure subsistence to have something to lose and something to defend. Scutage was not glamorous. It did not come with a title or a sword or a seat at the high table, but it was secure, and security in a world organized around obligation and hierarchy was not nothing. It was, in fact, a great deal. Then there was sergeanty. Land held by sergeanty was land held in exchange for a specific, named non-military service to the lord, usually the king, not 40 days on horseback in full armor, something defined, something odd sometimes, something that gives you a glimpse through a crack in the centuries of the strange texture of a world that organized everything around personal obligation and the need to give it a concrete form. Sergeanty came in varieties. Grand sergeanty involved services to the king himself, the carrying of the royal banner, the provision of a certain number of arrows before a military campaign, the serving of a specific dish at the coronation feast. These were not trivial, not comic. They were the visible expression of the relationship between a tenant and the crown, made real in a physical act on the day it mattered most. But then there was petty sergeanty. And this is where the medieval world's genius for specificity becomes something close to wonder. In the county of Suffolk, in the manor of Hemingston, a tenant held his land by a service that was recorded in the medieval Liber Feodorum, the Book of Fees, in Latin that translates, with no real ambiguity, to this: the service of leaping, whistling and farting before the king each Christmas. The Latin, should you require it, was per saltum, sufflum, et petum, per jump, per blow, per wind. And before you allow that to settle into mere comedy, consider what it actually is. It is a man holding land, having made a deal with the crown, a deal specific enough to be written into an official record, a deal that required him to appear before the king once a year on a specific feast day and perform 3 named acts. It is the medieval obsession with naming, with anchoring every relationship in a concrete, witnessed, undeniable thing, taken to its most vivid extreme. The land was real, the tenure was real, the obligation was strange, and it was real. Most sergeanties were rather less memorable: the provision of a pair of gloves, the rendering of a hawk, the maintenance of a specific bridge. The point is the principle. Free tenure could be attached to almost any conceivable obligation, as long as it was defined, fixed, and not the open-ended servile labor that marked the villain's life. So now you have the shape of the free peasant's world, a fixed payment or a defined service, recourse to the royal courts, the ability to come and go, a holding measured in established units that gave the whole arrangement its physical architecture. Those units are worth knowing. The standard holding, the thing thought sufficient to support a single family in modest sufficiency, was the virgate, also called the yardland, and it amounted to roughly 30 acres, though the acre itself varied from place to place, and the 30 was always a rough approximation rather than a surveyor's measurement. The virgate was the baseline unit of peasant prosperity, the thing you hoped to inherit or accumulate, the measure against which a household's position in the village was quietly calibrated. Below it sat the bovate, also called the oxgang, which ran to around 15 acres, half a virgate, the holding of someone who was managing but not thriving, who needed to work for others in the gaps between their own cultivation to keep the year from going wrong at the end. And below that there was something harder to hold, the cotar, the border, names for the same essential condition, the cottager who held a few acres at most, sometimes just a garden, and a strip or two in the open fields, and who survived by selling labour to his more prosperous neighbours. This was not serfdom. The cotar might be technically free. But freedom without land to back it up was thin, and the cottager's life was precarious in a way that no legal category could entirely conceal. When the harvest was bad and wages dropped and the winter came long and wet, the man with 3 acres and a half-rotted thatch stood close to the edge of things that it is unpleasant to contemplate, even now, by lamplight, at a great distance. This is where the town and its year-and-a-day miracle comes back into the picture, because the people most tempted by the walls of the chartered town were not always the serfs. Sometimes they were the cotters, the marginally free, the barely holding on, the men and women for whom another bad season would mean losing the strip and the cottage and sliding into wage dependence with nothing behind them. The town offered wages. The town offered variety. The town offered the possibility, faint but real, of a different kind of life than the one the village had assigned you at birth. And once you were inside those walls, breathing that air, the old world of strips and domain and multure and heriot began to fade, and a new world of exchanges and guilds and charters took its place, but not yet. Not quite yet. Because between the tied serf, the free smallholder, and the town there was another life to account for, a life embedded in the village itself. Indispensable to it, neither lord nor peasant in the full sense. A life defined by a skill specific enough to set its owner apart from the mass of agricultural labour. The village craftsman, the specialist, the man or sometimes the woman whose hands did something other than grip a plough handle. Every village of any size needed certain skills to function. Not all of them, but there were 2 whose absence made the whole place grind to a halt. One was the miller, the other was the smith. The miller you already know something about in the form of his monopoly and the resentment it bred. But the man himself is worth pausing on. He occupied a position of structural power that was deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved. He was indispensable because the mill was indispensable, and the mill was indispensable because bread was the center of everything, and bread required ground grain, and ground grain in any useful quantity required the mill's turning stones. The miller controlled a bottleneck. Every bushel of grain that every villager harvested had to pass through his hands on its way to becoming flour, and the multure, his cut of the grain as payment for the grinding, meant that he was always, by the nature of the job, handling other people's food. The opportunity for a thumb on the scale, for a handful extra swept into the miller's own sack, for a measuring cup that was slightly generous on the incoming and slightly mean on the outgoing, was structural and daily and essentially unverifiable. Hence the proverb, "No miller ever went to heaven with clean hands." Hence Chaucer's miller riding to Canterbury in the Canterbury Tales, his thumb of gold, his cheerful dishonesty worn as a kind of badge, a comic villain who is funny precisely because every person in the medieval audience recognized the type immediately. The miller's proverbial dishonesty was not a joke invented by poets. It was a settled social fact, a piece of shared knowledge passed down by people who had actually stood at the mill mouth watching their grain disappear into someone else's hands and come out as less flour than they expected. But the miller was also, in his way, a skilled operator of expensive and complicated infrastructure. The millstones themselves were heavy, specific, carefully dressed on their grinding faces in a pattern that required maintenance and knowledge. The mill pond, the sluice, the wooden gearing that transferred the water's turn to the stone, all of it required a man who understood it, who could repair it when it broke, who could read the sound of the mechanism and know when something was wearing wrong. The miller was not a peasant doing unskilled labor. He was a specialist operating the most complex piece of machinery most villagers would ever encounter. And however much they resented him, they could not do without him. The smith occupied a different kind of indispensability. Where the miller controlled food, the smith controlled tools and animals, and in an agricultural economy that was largely the same thing. Every plough in the open fields needed iron to function. The coulter, the vertical blade that cut the soil ahead of the share, was iron. The share itself, the angled piece that turned the earth, was iron. The harrow that broke the clods after ploughing was iron-tined. The axles of the carts that carried the harvest were iron-banded, and the horses and oxen that pulled all of it needed iron shoes, fitted by a man with a fire and an anvil, and the specific knowledge of how to shape a hot shoe to a cold hoof without laming the animal. The smith and the farrier were often the same man, or at least men with overlapping trades, and between them they kept the whole agricultural machine in working order. The smith's forge was a fixed, permanent structure, not something you could pack up and carry. This gave him a stability in the village that the travelling tinker or the peddler lacked. He was there. He was the man you went to when the plough broke in the middle of ploughing season, and every day of delay was a day of lost cultivation. He worked at the edge of something that felt, to the agricultural village, a little like the supernatural, or at least like a controlled version of a force that the rest of the village treated with great caution. Fire. Hot metal, the transformation of a lump of iron into a horseshoe or a blade or a hinge, accomplished by a man in an apron in a building that glowed orange through its gaps after dark. The smith had a social status that was complicated, that mixed respect and a faint unease, that belonged to neither the purely agricultural world nor the purely commercial one, but sat in its own category. Beyond these two essential figures, the village contained a rotating cast of other craftsmen whose presence varied by the size of the settlement and the prosperity of the surrounding area. The carpenter and the wheelwright, whose skills overlapped enough that a single man often covered both, because carts needed both the woodwork of the body and the wheels, and wheels were intricate things. The spokes mortised into the hub, and the rim, the iron tire fitted around the outside. The thatcher, who kept the roofs of the village intact, who climbed up with his bundles of reeds or straw and laid them in overlapping courses that would shed the rain for years before they needed replacing. The cooper, who made barrels, and barrels in a world without refrigeration or tin cans were not a luxury. They were the container in which everything that needed to be stored was stored. Ale, salted meat, grain, fish. The cooper was as structurally embedded in the village's logistics as the miller without the miller's particular load of resentment. The tanner, who converted raw hides into leather, was indispensable but unpleasant in a specific and memorable way. Tanning involved soaking hides in pits of urine and dung and crushed oak bark for months at a time, and the smell was serious enough that tanners were often pushed to the edges of settlements, downwind and downstream, as much as the layout of the village allowed. From the leather came the cobbler, or rather the cordwainer, the maker of shoes from new leather, a distinction the medieval crafts maintained carefully because the trade in old leather, the recycling of worn-out shoes into patched ones, was considered a different and lesser occupation. A cordwainer made new shoes from new leather, and shoes were not trivial. They were the difference between feet that lasted through a winter of field work and feet that did not. Add the potter, who made the vessels that carried and stored everything that did not go into a barrel. Add the dyer in larger villages who took the undyed cloth woven in the cottages and turned it into something colourable, saleable, wearable. Add the rope maker, the basket weaver, the candle maker. The village was not a single uniform mass of agricultural labour, It was a small economy with its own division of labour, its own specialists, its own modest internal market, and the craftsmen who occupied the skilled edges of it were people whose lives had a slightly different shape from the open field farmers, less tied to the rhythms of ploughing and harvest, more tied to the rhythms of demand and material supply. And then there was the brewery and the brewster. Brewing in the medieval countryside was, overwhelmingly, a woman's trade. This is not a secondary fact, it is one of the central economic facts of the period for a large portion of the female population of every village in England. Ale, not water, was the safe drink. Water sources were unreliable, and the fermentation process in brewing killed enough of what you did not want in your drinking supply that ale was genuinely safer than most available water. It was consumed in enormous quantities by everyone, including children, at a strength much lower than modern beers, but present at every meal, in every household, in every season. Somebody had to make it. The brewster, the female brewer, the alewife, brewed in her own home using her own equipment and sold it from her own door or from a building attached to her property. She would put out a sign, often literally, a stick or a pole decorated with something that indicated fresh ale was available, and the village would know to come and buy. It was small-scale, domestic, embedded in the household economy, and it was regulated. The regulation came in the form of the assize of ale. This was a royal ordinance, repeatedly issued and repeatedly enforced by the local authorities, that set the price of ale relative to the price of grain. When grain was expensive, ale was expensive. When grain was cheap, ale was cheap. The purpose was to prevent brewsters from profiting too much from scarcity or gouging customers during bad harvests. Violations were fined in the manorial courts, and the court rolls of English manors record the fines paid by named alewives with a regularity that tells you two things at once. First, that the regulation was taken seriously enough to be enforced. Second, that the fines were small enough that many brewsters simply paid them as a cost of doing business and kept on brewing. There is something in those records, those long columns of female names followed by small amounts of money, that gives you a glimpse of a layer of economic life that the larger narrative of kings and barons and knights tends to obscure. Here were women in village after village, running a trade, paying their fines, earning their income, operating within a regulatory framework, and pushing against its edges in the small, persistent way of people who need to make a living and have found a way to do it. The alewife was a figure of some suspicion in medieval literature, often depicted as a cheat who watered her ale or used a short measure, a counterpart to the dishonest miller in the collective mental portrait of people who handled your food and your drink and could not entirely be trusted. But she was also simply someone doing work that needed doing in the only setting available to her, with the tools and the knowledge she had. Now hold all of that for a moment. The serf in the field, the free tenant paying his fixed rent at Michaelmas, the cotar with his few acres and his wage labour to supplement them, the sergeanty holder with his strange and specific obligation, the miller at his monopoly mill, the smith at his forge, the cordwainer, the cooper, the thatcher, the alewife at her door with her pole and her fresh barrel. This is the lower portion of the ladder, the enormous base on which everything else rests, the part that contained, in the medieval English countryside, the vast majority of actual human beings. They are not a uniform mass. They are not interchangeable. They have names, specific obligations, specific legal statuses, specific relationships to the land and to the people above them. They have a few small routes of exit, the town's year and a day, the church's open door, which we have not yet reached, the slow accumulation of money that might buy a little more freedom, one generation at a time. And they are all, every one of them, operating within a framework that is about to come into sharper focus as we climb, because here is what the picture from the bottom cannot yet show you. Those named fines, merchant and heriot and tallage and multure, they are not arbitrary cruelties, though they feel like it from where the serf stands. They are the bottom expression of something that extends all the way to the top of the pyramid, a single logic repeated in different vocabularies at every rung, like a chord played in different registers on different instruments, recognizable as the same chord, no matter how far up the scale you go. The free tenant paying his fixed rent at Michaelmas is doing something structurally similar to what the serf is doing with his week work and his boon days. He is compensating someone above him for the use of land that is not, in the ultimate legal sense, his. He holds it, he farms it, he passes it to his children, but somewhere in the chain of title it belongs to someone else, and the rent is the acknowledgement of that fact, made real in coin twice a year. Go one rung up from the free tenant and you will find that the same logic operates, dressed in different clothes, using different words with different stakes. And the further up you go, the grander the vocabulary becomes, the more the language shifts from fines and rents to incidents and feudal dues and the ceremonial language of homage and fealty. But the structure underneath the language is the same structure you watch play out in the field and the mill yard and the manor court. We are not there yet, but the shape of it is becoming visible. And so we rise, we leave the byre and the mill yard and the alewife's door and the cordwainer's bench, and we climb toward the town, where a different kind of life was being assembled out of different materials that had names like charter and guild and burgess and masterpiece, names that carried in them a whole different theory of how a human being could hold a place in the world. The town was not just a larger village, it was a different kind of entity altogether, defined not by its fields and its open field rotation, but by its legal personality, its charter, the specific written agreement between the community and the crown that gave the town a set of rights and obligations distinct from everything around it. The charter was the town's founding document, its constitution in miniature, and what it typically granted was something both practical and profound. The right to hold markets, the right to collect its own tolls, the right to manage its own affairs in certain defined ways, and crucially, a specific form of land tenure that made the town's relationship to property fundamentally different from anything in the manor. This tenure was called burgage. A burgess, a full member of the chartered town, held his plot of land in the town for a fixed money rent, just as a free rural tenant held his virgate, but with additional features that made the urban version distinctly more powerful. He could sell it, he could pass it to whomever he chose. He had, in the formal and technical sense, a freehold in the urban economy, and that freehold was his in a way that most rural tenures, even free ones, were not quite. And here is something worth letting settle slowly, because it carries a weight that only becomes apparent when you think about what lay behind it. Many towns, as they grew prosperous enough and organized enough, made a specific arrangement with the crown called farming the borough. Under this arrangement, the town as a collective entity paid a single lump sum to the king each year in exchange for the right to collect its own taxes and fees internally. The king got a guaranteed income without the trouble of managing a complicated urban revenue stream. The town got control of its own financial life. This was not a small thing. It was the town, as a community, standing up and saying we will manage our own affairs, and the crown agreeing, because the lump sum was reliable and the alternative was expensive. The farm of the borough was the charter made financial, the town's self-governance given a monetary form. Inside that self-governing space, organized by the charter and animated by the burgage tenures and the farm of the borough, the people of the medieval town built a second set of institutions that had no real equivalent in the village. These were the guilds. And they deserve a long, slow look because they were stranger and more complete than the word usually suggests. There were, in the medieval town, two kinds of guild, and it matters to hold them apart in the mind before letting them blur together, because they operated at different scales and served different purposes, even when they overlapped in membership and location. The first was the merchant guild, the second was the craft guild, and there were many of those, one for each distinct trade. The merchant guild was the older and broader institution. It was, in essence, the organized commercial class of the town, speaking with one voice, controlling who could trade within the borough's boundaries and on what terms, setting the tone of the market and protecting its own members from outside competition. The craft guilds were narrower and deeper. Each governed a single trade with an intensity that a modern person would find remarkable, reaching into the working life of every practitioner of that craft in ways that extended far beyond the hours of labor. To understand what being a member of a craft guild actually meant, you have to follow a single person through the arc of their working life, because the guild was not a static membership you joined, but a ladder you climbed, and the climbing took most of a lifetime. You began as an apprentice. This was a formal legal arrangement sealed by a written document called an indenture, from the Latin for the notched or toothed cut made along the edge of the parchment before it was torn in two. One half kept by the master who would train you, one half kept by your family or guardian, so that if a dispute arose, the two ragged edges could be pressed together and proved to fit, and no forgery was possible. Under that indenture, you were bound to your master for a term of roughly 7 years, though the exact duration varied by trade and by town. You lived in his house, you ate at his table or close to it, you received no wages or virtually none. What you received instead was instruction, the gradual and closely guarded transmission of the craft's knowledge, its techniques and its judgments, and its small accumulated wisdoms, passed from hands to hands across generations. This was not a casual arrangement. The master took on a legal obligation to teach you, and you took on a legal obligation to serve faithfully, to not run away, to not embarrass the household, to not reveal the trade's secrets to outsiders. The indenture bound both parties with a seriousness that the village had no real equivalent for. In the village, you learned farming because the whole community did it around you, openly in the shared fields, visible to everyone. In the craft guild, the knowledge was bounded, protected, transmitted only within the structure, and the indenture was the instrument of that protection. 7 years is a long time. By the end of it, if you had learned well and the master had taught honestly, you knew the craft from the inside. But you were not yet a master yourself. You stepped out of the apprenticeship into the next stage, and this second stage had a name that came from a word meaning simply a single day. You became a journeyman from the French journey, which is the day's portion, the day's journey, the day's work. A journeyman was paid by the day. He was now a wage earner, free in a way the apprentice was not, able in principle to move from one master's workshop to another, selling his labor to whoever would buy it. He slept where he found lodging rather than necessarily in the master's house. He had his own money, however modest the amounts, and yet he was still not at the top. The guild sat above him still, and above the guild sat the rank of master, and between him and that rank stood a final gate. To become a master, admitted to the full privileges of the guild, entitled to take on apprentices of his own and run an independent workshop and participate in the guild's governance, a journeyman had to produce something. He had to make with his own hands and without assistance a single object that demonstrated his complete command of the craft. This object was judged by the existing masters of the guild, men who knew the trade in its finest details, who could see in the grain of a cut or the finish of a surface or the join of two pieces of material whether the work was truly excellent or merely passable. This object they called the masterpiece. That is where the word comes from. Not from an artist's greatest achievement, not from a vague superlative applied to anything admired, but from this specific gatekeeping function. The one piece of work that proved you had mastered the craft and could be admitted as a master among masters. The word has since drifted into broader use, and we apply it now to symphonies and novels and paintings, but its origin is this practical, rigorous, utterly specific examination conducted in a medieval workshop while men who had spent decades perfecting their own hands looked carefully at yours. If they approved it, you were in. If they did not, you went back to journeyman wages and tried again. The guild did not rush this process. It had every reason not to. Too many masters meant too much competition within the trade, prices falling, quality standards harder to maintain, the reputation of the town's goods in the wider market at risk. The gate was genuine, the judgment real, and the men conducting it had a financial interest in keeping standards high and the number of new entrants limited. But the guild was not only a barrier and a cartel, though it was certainly both of those things. It was also something closer to a complete social institution, a kind of parallel community that wrapped around the working lives of its members and reached into their personal and spiritual lives as well. The guilds provided what we might call mutual insurance, though that phrase makes it sound colder and more mechanical than it actually was. If a master fell ill and could not work, the guild maintained him. If a member died, the guild paid for the funeral, and it paid also for masses to be said for his soul, because in the medieval understanding, the prayers of the living were effective for the dead, and the guild's collective devotion was part of what membership meant. If a member's widow was left destitute, the guild might support her. If an apprentice's master died before the apprenticeship was complete, the guild arranged for the boy to be transferred to another master rather than abandoned. The guild was, in this sense, a welfare system embedded inside a trade organization, and the two functions were not felt as separate but as naturally unified because the craft community was a real community, sharing not only tools and knowledge but a common stake in one another's survival. The guilds also governed the market in ways that shaped every transaction within their trades. They set wages so that masters could not compete with one another by simply undercutting the going rate for labor, which would have impoverished the journeyman and destabilized the whole system. They set prices, or at least the floor below which a product should not be sold, so that the cheap and the shoddy could not drive out the well-made. They set quality standards with inspectors who could enter a workshop unannounced and examine the work, and if it was found defective or dishonest, the goods could be confiscated and the member fined or worse. They set hours, limiting when work could be done, partly to protect the labor of members and partly for reasons connected to the quality of light and therefore the quality of work, because fine craft done by candlelight was not the same as fine craft done in good daylight. All of this made the guild a remarkably powerful structure for organizing economic life at the town level. And at the top of that structure, where the wealthiest merchants operated across whole networks of trade that extended far beyond any single town's walls, the possibilities were extraordinary. The wool trade is the clearest English example. England's great medieval export was wool, raw fleeces clipped from the vast sheep flocks of the English countryside and shipped across the Channel to the looms of Flanders and Italy, and the men who organized that trade, who bought in bulk from the sheep farmers and arranged the transport and dealt with the foreign merchants and managed the credit and absorbed the risk, those men accumulated wealth on a scale that had no precedent in the rural economy. One figure stands out, not as an exception, but as the most extreme expression of a possibility that the mercantile world was beginning to open up. William de la Pole was a wool merchant from Hull who operated in the early 14th century, and his story traces the furthest reach of what commercial success could accomplish inside the medieval order. He lent money to the English crown. He financed military campaigns. He became, over the course of a career built on wool and credit, one of the wealthiest men in England, a man whose financial resources gave him a kind of power that overlapped with, and in some ways exceeded the power of many of the barons who held their status by inherited land and military obligation. His descendants were eventually ennobled, rising into the ranks of the aristocracy, which meant that the wool trade pursued with sufficient intelligence and persistence and luck, could move a family not just to comfort, but to dukedom. The merchants who read the charter and paid the burgage tenure and participated in the guild were not simply escaping the village. Some of them were, over generations, escaping their social rank entirely. But that ascent required time and the right circumstances and a great deal of accumulated advantage. For most people in the medieval town, the guild provided a stable, if demanding, framework, and the masterpiece was the summit of what was practically achievable. And that was enough. A master craftsman in a medieval town was a person of standing. He owned his shop or held it on very favourable terms. He employed apprentices and journeymen. He participated in the governance of his guild, and through the guild, in the governance of the town. His opinion mattered in a way that the serf's opinion had never mattered on the manor, and in a way that even the free peasant's opinion had mattered only collectively in the slow, grinding decisions of the manor court. And so the town has given us a rung on the ladder that the village could not have produced, a rung built from the charter and the burgage and the guild and the masterpiece, from the assize of ale that regulated the brewster's trade and the indenture that bound the apprentice and the checkered cloth of the merchant's guild hall where disputes were settled. It is a rung with its own pressures and its own obligations, but those obligations are to the guild and the town rather than to the lord of the manor, and that distinction, quiet as it sounds, was one of the defining freedoms of medieval life. You still owed something. But what you owed, and to whom, had fundamentally changed. Now we climb further. We leave the town and its charters behind. We enter a world where the primary currency is not wool or silver coin, but land and armed service, and where the binding document is not an indenture or a guild ordinance, but something older and stranger and more physical, a ceremony conducted between two men in which one knelt before the other and placed his hands, palms together like a man in prayer, between the open hands of the one who stood above him. We enter the world of the knight. The knight's relationship to the social order above him was defined by a single Latin word, feudum, from which we get the English word fief, and from which historians eventually built the larger word feudalism to describe the whole system of land tenure and military obligation. A fief was land, but it was land of a specific kind, land held from a lord above in exchange for a specific and named form of service. And for the knight, that service was military. It was, in its most reduced and formal statement, 40 days a year of mounted armed service at the knight's own expense. That was the core bargain. The lord granted the land. The knight, in return, was required to show up, armed and horsed, for 40 days each year when the lord called him out. The unit in which this was measured and assessed was called the knight's fee, a somewhat variable quantity that referred to the amount of land notionally sufficient to support and equip one knight. In practice, this was often thought of in terms of hides, an old English land unit that varied by region, with roughly 5 hides, sometimes taken as a rough approximation, though the actual assessments ranged considerably, and the historians who have studied the surviving records have found enormous variation in what actually counted as a knight's fee in any given part of the country. The fee was an accounting fiction as much as a geographical reality, a way of tracking the military obligation owed by a given parcel of land rather than a precise measurement of the land itself. To take on a fief and become a knight, you participated in a ceremony that was as close as the medieval secular world came to a sacrament. It began with homage. You knelt before your lord. You placed your hands pressed together between his. He closed his hands around yours, and in that gesture of enclosure, which was ancient and which connected the ceremony to much older practices of submission and protection, you became his man. The word homage comes from the Latin homo, meaning man, and that is precisely what it meant. You were, from this moment, this lord's man, bound to him by the most personal and physical of pledges. Then you swore fealty, the oath of faith, on the Gospels or on the relics of a saint, promising to be faithful, to not betray him, to serve him as a man of honor served his lord. The ceremony was witnessed, it was recorded, it was in every sense available to the medieval world, legally binding. And what the knight received in return for this binding was not merely land, it was a social identity, a place in the order of things, a title and a function and a set of relationships that extended outward in all directions. The knight held a manor, or part of one, or several, depending on how substantial his fee was. He exercised jurisdiction over the people who lived on that land, held a local court, collected the rents and dues that his own tenants owed him. He was, in his own domain, something like a small lord, a man with dependents who looked to him as the serf looked to the lord of the manor, as the apprentice looked to the master, as the villager looked to the reeve. The hierarchy repeated itself at every scale, but the knight's life was expensive in a way that no other rung on the ladder quite matched, because the service he owed was military, and the equipment that military service demanded was the most capital-intensive investment of the medieval economy. Consider the warhorse. The destrier, the trained fighting horse that a knight was expected to ride into battle, was not an ordinary animal. It was a specialist creature, bred and trained over years, an animal that had been taught to stand steady in the noise and chaos of battle, to respond to signals given by the rider's legs and weight rather than by reins that a sword hand could not spare. The cost of such an animal was staggering. A destrier could cost as much as a small farm, which meant that the knight's most essential piece of equipment was itself a piece of capital roughly equivalent to the holdings of a free peasant. And the destrier was only the beginning. There was armor, first of mail, and then, increasingly, of plate, each piece made by skilled craftsmen who worked in specialized workshops and charged accordingly. There was a sword, and often a lance, and a shield, and the other weapons and tools that equipped a fighting man of the period. There was, for a knight of any standing, a squire, a young man in training who served him personally, managed his horses and his equipment, and who represented a further ongoing expense. There were remounts, because a knight who lost his horse in the field was a man on foot, and a man on foot was a knight no longer, and so the practical operation of military service demanded spare animals. When you added it all together, a single knight represented a capital investment roughly equivalent to what a prosperous small farmer might accumulate over a lifetime, all of it focused on one man's ability to show up for 40 days of service on horseback. This expense had consequences that reverberated through the whole structure of the system. As the 12th and 13th centuries passed, more and more lords and kings found it more convenient, and in some ways more effective, to accept a cash payment in lieu of military service rather than to actually summon their knights to the field. This payment had a name, scutage, from the Latin scutum, meaning shield. Shield money. Instead of showing up with your shield and your destrier and your 40 days, you paid. The money was then used to hire professional soldiers, men who fought for wages rather than for land, men who could be paid off at the end of a campaign and sent home without the complications of the feudal bond. Scutage was not a defeat for the system. It was an adaptation of the system, a recognition that military effectiveness increasingly required flexibility that the 40-day feudal levy could not provide. But it was also a sign of something deeper and more significant, the slow seeping of money into every corner of an arrangement that had originally been built on land and service and loyalty, the inexorable monetization of obligation. The knight's own obligations moved in this same direction, and the obligations that sat above him in the hierarchy, the obligations that bound him not only to his lord, but also made him subject to a set of named and formal claims on his estates, and his heirs, those obligations mirrored, in a more elevated register, exactly the same logic as the named dues that the serf owed at the bottom of the pyramid. The mirror is not accidental. It is, in fact, the deepest structural feature of the whole system, the thing this particular ascent is built to reveal. But that revelation belongs a little further on. First, there are the incidents of feudal tenure to understand. When a knight died, his heir did not simply step into the fief as a matter of course. The heir owed a payment called relief, a sum of money paid to the lord above for the right to inherit the land. The lord, in granting the fief, retained this power, this right to be paid again at every generational transfer, and the relief was the price of that transfer. It was, in its bones, structurally identical to the heriot that the serf's family paid when the villain died. The surrendered ox at the bottom of the pyramid, the cash payment at the middle. The specific form changed, the scale changed, the social register changed utterly, but the logic was the same. Someone died, something was owed to the person above. The hierarchy collected at every death. When a knight died leaving a minor heir, a child too young to perform military service, something more complex and in some ways more troubling happened. The lord took wardship, which meant the lord took control of the lands while the child was underage, managed those lands, drew the revenues from them, and was not required to account for them with anything like modern standards of fiduciary care. The ward's estates were, in practical terms, a resource the lord could exploit for the duration of the minority, limited mostly by the vague expectation that he should not strip them entirely and should hand them over in roughly working order when the heir came of age. Wardship was one of the most lucrative incidents of feudal tenure, and lords fought over it because a ward with rich estates was a small windfall that could last for years. And there was something further still. The lord held the right to arrange the marriage of a female heir or ward. This right, which sounds strange and intrusive to modern ears, was felt as straightforwardly economic in the medieval context. An heiress carried land with her into a marriage, and whoever she married would thereby gain control of that land. The lord above had a direct financial interest in ensuring that the land did not pass into the hands of someone who might be his enemy or someone who would reduce the military value of the holding. So the lord could sell the right of marriage, offering the heiress's hand to whoever was willing to pay for it, and the price reflected the value of the estates she carried. An orphaned heiress from a wealthy family was, in the language of the time, a piece of property in the most literal sense, and her marriage was an asset on the lord's balance sheet as surely as a field or a mill. Finally, there were the aids, the contributions a vassal owed his lord on specific named occasions, when the lord's eldest son was knighted, when the lord's eldest daughter was married, and when the lord himself was taken prisoner and required ransom. These were the three classic occasions, the moments when the lord could call on his vassals for a cash payment beyond the ordinary obligations of tenure. The aids were, in theory, limited to these occasions. In practice, pressure could be applied in other directions, and the line between a legitimate aid and an arbitrary exaction was not always easy to draw. The knight, therefore, for all his martial prestige and his ceremony of homage and his expensive destrier, was caught in a web of obligations that touched him at every major moment of his life and his family's life. He owed service, or money in lieu of service. His heir owed relief at his death. His children might be taken into wardship. His daughters' marriages were not entirely his to arrange. He owed aids on occasions he did not control. The fief was his, but it was not entirely his, and the lord above him maintained a constant, low presence in his affairs through these named and formal mechanisms. This is the moment to let the pattern surface, not as a summary, but as a recognition, a noticing of something that has been present all along in the texture of each rung. because what the knight owed his lord at death, and what his heir paid to step into the estate, and what was taken when he left minor children. These were not inventions peculiar to the knightly class. They were the same mechanism that the serf's family encountered when the villain died and the lord's agent came for the best beast. Heriot at the bottom, relief in the middle. The logic was identical. Someone died, the person above collected. The specific payment changed in form and scale and social meaning, but the underlying claim, the lord's perpetual stake in the tenant's most important life events, that claim was constant from the lowest rung to the highest. And if you wanted to know how seriously the men at the top of the system took these incidents of tenure, you needed only to look at what they were willing to do to protect themselves from them. The most consequential political document of the medieval English world was produced in the year 1215 precisely because a group of barons had decided that the king was abusing exactly these mechanisms. The king was charging excessive relief. He was exploiting wardships beyond any reasonable limit. He was selling marriages in ways that felt more like extortion than governance. He was demanding scutage too frequently and at too high a rate. And the barons, who were themselves the direct tenants of the crown, the men who felt these pressures most acutely because they held the largest fiefs and therefore had the most to lose when the incidents were abused, those barons forced a reckoning. That reckoning produced Magna Carta, and what is worth understanding about Magna Carta in this context, as we climb the ladder and look back at the whole structure we have ascended, is that in its origins it was not a general declaration of human liberty. It was, at its core, a list of complaints about feudal incidents and a set of caps on how those incidents could be applied. The early clauses of the document, the ones that came before the famous phrases about free men and unlawful imprisonment, those early clauses were a baron's accounting document, a detailed specification of what relief should cost, how wardship should operate, when marriage could be sold and when it could not, how scutage should be assessed. The liberties that later generations found in Magna Carta were real, and they grew genuinely important over centuries of interpretation and expansion. But the seed from which the document grew was a dispute over feudal finance, a fight between a king and his tenants-in-chief over the named mechanisms by which the crown collected money from the people who held land directly from it. The king, in this dispute, was not some monster outside the system. He was the system's apex, the person at the very top of the pyramid where all the chains of obligation converged, and he was doing exactly what every lord at every rung did to the people below him, collecting the incidents, pressing the advantages, extracting value from the relationship of tenure. He was doing it more aggressively than the barons thought was legitimate, but he was doing it with the same instruments that every lord in England used at every level. The barons who forced the king to sign were themselves pressing exactly these same instruments on their own knights and their own tenants. They wanted the king to stop, or at least to moderate, the thing they themselves practiced without restraint on the people below them. This was not hypocrisy so much as the entirely consistent logic of a system in which each rung protected itself from the rung above while accepting its privileges over the rung below. And so the charter that became the foundation of English constitutional law was, at its moment of creation, a document about heriot and relief, and wardship and marriage about the same named dues and incidents that we first encountered when the serf's family surrendered the best beast to the lord's agent on the morning after the old man died. The scale had changed entirely. The language was different, the social register entirely different, the consequences for English history enormous and far-reaching. But the logic was the same three-part bargain recurring at every level. You hold something from someone above, you owe them a price at the moments that matter most, and the agreement between you is sealed by loyalty and oath and the naming of what is owed. There is something strangely restful in that recognition, if you let yourself sit with it. Not restful because the system was just or comfortable for the people inside it, but restful in the sense of a pattern becoming visible, a hidden structure revealing itself in the texture of each rung. The serf who surrendered the ox did not know he was performing a gesture that the greatest barons in England performed also, at a different scale, with different words, in different circumstances. He just knew that his father was dead and the Lord's man was at the door. But the structure that produced that morning at the serf's cottage and the structure that produced Magna Carta were the same structure, running from the soil to the crown without interruption, the same 3 threads wound tight at every knot. We are not done climbing. There is still the full weight of the baronial world to understand, the great lords who held directly from the king and sub-infeudated downward through layers of lesser vassals, and there is the manor's internal economy with its reeve and its hayward and its open field strips lying in the thin early light. And there is a parallel structure that has been waiting patiently alongside this whole ascent, neither quite above nor quite below, cutting across the secular hierarchy at every level, and offering something the secular world could not, which was the possibility of rising by grace and talent rather than by birth or money. That is the church, and its ladder is the strangest and in some ways the most interesting of all. But for now, let the knight rest in his expensive armour, the destrier standing in the stable behind the hall, the indenture of homage folded somewhere in the Lord's chest. Let the journeyman's wages settle into the quiet of the guild hall, the masterpiece cooling on the workbench after the master's hands have passed over it. Let the burgess sleep in his burgage tenement, the charter hanging in the town's archive, the farm of the borough paid, the town's accounts, its own to keep. The ladder has more rungs, the pattern has more iterations, and there is still the question planted at the beginning of this ascent of the one door in the entire pyramid through which a man of no land and no birth and no military value could, in theory, rise above everyone else on this list. That door is still ahead of us. And it opens inward into candlelight and Latin and the smell of incense and old stone, into a world with its own rules and its own hierarchy and its own named dues, a world that was in some ways the mirror of everything we have climbed through and in other ways entirely unlike it. The baron, at this level of the pyramid, holds his lands not from another baron but directly from the king. He is what the records call a tenant-in-chief, and that phrase matters more than it sounds. It means there is no intermediary between him and the crown. When the king summons, the baron answers to the king personally, not through a chain of smaller lords. His name appears in the great surveys and in the king's own records, and the lands he holds are measured not in strips or virgates, but in whole manors, sometimes dozens of them, scattered across counties. But holding directly from the king does not mean holding freely. The same logic that bound the serf to the land and the knight to his 40 days of service binds the baron too, only the currency is different, and the scale is larger, and the occasions when the obligation falls due are more formal and more expensive. The baron's primary duty was the servitium debitum, the service owed. That phrase means, in plain terms, that his barony was assessed at a fixed number of knights, and when the king called for an army, the baron was expected to produce them. Not to fight himself alone, but to arrive with his quota of mounted men, armed and horsed and ready, all at his own initial cost. To meet that quota, he had done what lords do. He had taken his land and divided pieces of it out, granted parcels to knights below him who held those parcels in exchange for their own service. This is what the legal records call sub-infeudation, a word that sounds technical but describes something entirely practical. The baron could not personally be 40 knights at once, so he built his own pyramid underneath him, with each rung holding from the rung above, each one owing something in return. He was, in miniature, doing to his knights exactly what the king was doing to him. And in this way the whole structure repeated itself downward and upward simultaneously. Every man in the pyramid was both a lord, relative to those below, and a tenant, relative to those above. The baron was a great lord to his knights and a tenant to his king. The same logic applied to the bishop, which we will come to. The same logic, in a rougher form, applied to the reeve in his village, who managed the lord's affairs and answered upward while dealing daily with the people below. The pyramid was a series of nested contracts, each one identical in shape, different only in the name of the currency being exchanged. What made the baron's position both privileged and perilous was the set of occasions when the king could reach into his estates and take something. These occasions had names, just as the serfs' fines had names, and knowing the names is knowing the system. Relief was the payment an heir had to make to inherit his father's barony. When the old baron died and the son wished to step into his place, he could not simply walk through the gate and announce himself lord. He had to pay the king a sum of money, sometimes very large, for the privilege of succession. It was not a fine, it was not a punishment. It was, in the language of the time, simply what was owed. The land was held of the king, and when the tenure passed from one generation to the next, the king's hand extended. Wardship was more intrusive still. If the baron died while his heir was still a minor, the king took control of the lands entirely for the duration of the minority. He appointed himself the guardian, and as guardian he was entitled to draw the revenues of the barony, to administer its affairs, and to keep the profits. He was supposed to maintain the estates and hand them back in good condition when the heir came of age, but supervision of that obligation was imperfect, and wardship in practice could be a systematic extraction. The lands were managed for the guardian's benefit, not the heir's, and the difference between maintenance and exploitation was often negotiated rather than enforced. Marriage was property. An heiress, or a young ward whose marriage had not yet been arranged, represented a valuable asset, because whoever married her would control her lands. The king, as guardian, held the right to arrange that marriage, which meant effectively that he could sell it. The ward had some protection against being married to someone beneath her station, but within those limits the king could grant the right to nominate the husband to someone else, could sell it to a bidder, could use it as a reward for service or loyalty. It was a transaction, and it was conducted as one. Aid was the cash levy the king could call on at certain set occasions, when he knighted his eldest son, when he married his eldest daughter, and when he needed to be ransomed from captivity. These were the legitimate occasions for aid, and the barons owed the payment without argument. Beyond these occasions, demands for money required consent, and that requirement for consent was the fault line along which the great political crises of the medieval centuries ran. Magna Carta, sealed in the meadow at Runnymede in 1215, is often taught as the founding document of human liberty, and in some sense that is true, but the truth is more specific and more interesting. At its core, it was a baron's invoice. The opening clauses, clauses 2 through 8, deal directly with the incidents: relief, wardship, marriage, aid. They set limits. They say what the relief for an earldom should be, what the relief for a knight's fee should be, that the king should not sell or deny or delay justice, that wardship should not strip the estates bare. The famous clause about no man being imprisoned without lawful judgment grew from the same root. The barons had found the king using imprisonment and financial pressure as weapons against them, as tools to extract compliance and money outside the agreed framework. The document is a list of grievances in legal form, a contract being renegotiated, and the liberties that later generations would find universal had their origin in a very specific argument between the King of England and the men who held their land directly from him. That argument was, in miniature, the argument every rung of the pyramid was having simultaneously. What exactly do I owe? What are the limits? And what happens when those limits are crossed? Below the baron's political negotiations, the actual ground on which all of this rested was the manor, not as a symbol or a legal abstraction, but as a working piece of land producing food, managing labor, collecting dues, and sustaining the whole structure from underneath. The manor was the unit of production, and understanding how it actually worked is understanding how the pyramid fed itself. The manor's land was divided into 3 broadly different categories, and each category had a different function. The domain was the lord's personal portion, the fields that were worked directly for his benefit, producing grain and hay and livestock that went into his barns and his larder without any intermediary taking a share. It was farmed partly by the serf labor owed as week work, partly by hired hands paid in cash or kind, and partly by the boon work of the whole village, summoned at harvest. The domain was the lord's direct income from the soil. The tenant holdings were the strips and parcels distributed among the villein and free tenants, the land they farmed for themselves, from which they fed their families and paid their rent and their dues. These were not individually fenced blocks, but scattered strips in the great open fields, which brings us to the system of agriculture that governed daily life for most of the medieval period in northern Europe. The open field system meant exactly what it says: huge, unfenced expanses of land, each one divided into long, narrow strips called celians, each celian owned or held by a different tenant, and each tenant's holding scattered across the field rather than collected in one contiguous block. This sounds inefficient, and perhaps it was, but it served a purpose. Soil quality varied across a field, with better drained higher ground and wetter lower ground and patches of more fertile soil distributed unevenly. By scattering each tenant's celians, the system ensured that good land and poor land were shared out, that no single tenant got all the best ground and another all the worst. It was a form of collective insurance, and it operated within a framework of collective decision-making. A village operating the open field system typically farmed 2 or 3 great fields in rotation. Under the 3-field rotation, one field was planted with a winter grain, wheat or rye, another with a spring grain, barley or oats or legumes, and the third was left fallow for the year, allowed to rest and recover its fertility, grazed by the village livestock whose manure would help it recover. The following year, the roles rotated. Every 3 years, each field went through all 3 stages. It was not a perfect system, and it could not indefinitely maintain yields without inputs from outside, but it was a rational system, and it was governed collectively. The decisions about when to plant and when to harvest, which strips to leave fallow, when to open the fields to common grazing after the harvest was in, were not made by any individual tenant alone. They were made collectively, enforced by the manor court. The manor court was the engine room of village governance. It came in 2 principal forms, the court baron and the court leet, which handled slightly different jurisdictions, the court baron dealing with land transfers and disputes between tenants, the court leet handling petty offences and the police of the village, the regulation of weights and measures, the presentment of nuisances. Both courts met at regular intervals, typically several times a year, and their proceedings were recorded by a clerk and the records stored. These are the court rolls that survive in their thousands in English archives, and they are among the most intimate documents the medieval period left behind, full of the actual names and actual disputes and actual fines of actual people. John, the son of Richard, who blocked the common path with his timber; Agnes, who brewed without license and was fined under the assize of ale; William, who failed to repair his section of hedge; Thomas, who came to court with a knife and was warned. The manor court also recorded every transfer of land. When a villein surrendered his holding, when a son inherited, when a piece of land changed hands between tenants, the the transaction was entered in the rolls and became part of the record. This made the court the village's memory as well as its court of law. Running the manor's daily operations required officers, and these officers were drawn partly from the peasant community itself, which is one of the more interesting features of the system. The reeve was the central figure. He was the village's elected foreman, chosen from among the villeins, and his position was uncomfortable by design. Upward, he was answerable to the lord steward and bailiff, responsible for ensuring that the domain was farmed efficiently, that week work was properly performed, that the lord's grain was harvested and stored. Downward, he was a neighbour, a fellow villain, someone who had to live in the village after the harvest accounts were done and the fines were levied. He occupied both worlds simultaneously and satisfied neither perfectly. The hayward was responsible for the hedges and fences and the growing crops, ensuring that livestock did not break through into the open fields before the harvest was in, and that the common rules were observed. The beadle assisted with the court's administrative work and the collection of fines. Above all of them, appointed by the lord rather than elected by the village, were the steward or seneschal, who presided over the manor court and managed the overall estate, and the bailiff, who supervised the day-to-day farming operations and kept the accounts. The difference between them was roughly the difference between a manager and an inspector. The bailiff was on the ground, the steward oversaw. All of this was regulated and advised by a body of accumulated knowledge about how estates should be run. Around the middle of the 13th century, a text called Walter of Henley's Husbandry was circulating among English estate managers, a practical manual for running a manor, covering the management of ploughlands and the calculation of how many acres a plough team could work in a day, how to audit the accounts of a reeve, how to calculate whether more grain should be sold or saved for seed. It was the medieval equivalent of a management handbook, and the fact that it was written and copied and circulated tells you that the management of these estates was a serious technical enterprise, not simply a matter of custom and tradition. And alongside all of this, running parallel to the secular hierarchy from the lowest village to the highest court, was the structure that had been waiting throughout this entire ascent, the church. Its ladder ran alongside the secular one without ever quite merging with it, and it offered something that the secular world in principle never could, the possibility of rising by talent and learning rather than by land and birth. Consider the shape of the ecclesiastical hierarchy and how it mirrors the secular one. At the top sat the Pope, whose authority extended across all of Latin Christendom, whose court in Rome received appeals from every kingdom, and whose legates travelled through every land. Below him, in each kingdom, were the archbishops presiding over the great metropolitan sees, Canterbury and York in England, each with authority over the bishops of their province. Below the archbishops, the bishops, each one responsible for a diocese, a defined territory, with his cathedral church at its centre, and his own court and administration and income. Below the bishops, the archdeacons, the deans, the chapter of canons, and finally, at the bottom of the hierarchy's secular reach, the parish priest, who served the smallest unit of the system, the local church and its congregation. Alongside the diocesan structure ran the monastic one, which had its own internal hierarchy. The abbot governed the monastery with near absolute authority within its walls, assisted by the prior, beneath whom the monks lived in community under the rule of their order. The great Benedictine abbeys were among the wealthiest institutions in England, their lands larger than many barons' holdings, their income drawn from rents and tithes and offerings, and the revenues of dependent churches. And later, the friars, the Franciscans and Dominicans arriving in the 13th century, added another variant, mobile and urban, and theoretically mendicant, though the reality of institutional wealth often complicated the theory of poverty. What funded the church at the parish level was primarily the tithe. Every 10th measure of produce grown in the parish, every 10th lamb, every 10th measure of grain, owed to the church as a matter of obligation that had the force of law. The tithe barn, the large building standing near many a parish church into which the 10th part was gathered and stored, was the physical embodiment of this arrangement. In a good year, it filled. In a poor year, the obligation remained, which made the tithe a source of friction between the parish and its priest, between the great monastery and the villages within whose lands it held tithe rights. The parish priest also held glebe land, fields that came with his office, and that he farmed for his own maintenance. He was, in a small way, a land-holding individual connected to the agricultural world of the village in a practical and daily way, his land worked by his own labour or hired hands, his income from a combination of the glebe's produce, the tithes fraction assigned to him, and the fees charged for the sacramental services of the church, baptisms, marriages, burials. The mortuary fee, a payment made to the priest when a parishioner died, mirrored in its structure the heriot paid to the Lord, and no one who owed both simultaneously failed to notice the resemblance. The clergy enjoyed a privilege that separated them entirely from the secular justice system. It was called benefit of clergy, and it meant that a person in clerical orders could not be tried in the royal courts for criminal offences. He could only be tried in the church's own courts, the ecclesiastical courts, which did not impose the death penalty. This was a substantial advantage in an age when the royal courts could and did hang people for crimes that an ecclesiastical court would punish with penance and imprisonment at most. In practice, benefit of clergy was extended and sometimes manipulated. The test applied was literacy. A person who could read a passage from the Bible was presumed to be a cleric and entitled to the privilege. The passage most often used was the opening verse of Psalm 51, Miserere mei Deus, have mercy on me, O God. It became known as the neck verse because being able to read it could save your neck. Illiterate men in genuine danger of hanging memorized it phonetically, learning the sounds without understanding the words, hoping to convince the court that they could read. It was a loophole in the system, and it was exploited, as loopholes are always exploited, by everyone who could find it. The higher clergy were integrated into the secular world in a way that seems paradoxical only if you think of the church as existing apart from the feudal structure. They did not exist apart from it. A bishop was simultaneously a prince of the church, holding his spiritual authority from the pope, and a feudal baron holding his episcopal lands from the king. He owed knight service for those lands, just as any baron did. When the king summoned his military tenants, the bishop's quota appeared in the roll alongside the lay barons, and the bishop was expected to provide mounted men just as a secular lord was. Some bishops led armies in person. Many administered their estates with all the expertise and attention of the most efficient lay lords, because their estates were as large and their obligations as complex. This dual nature of the episcopate was a source of continuous tension throughout the medieval centuries. The question of who controlled appointments to bishoprics, the king who wanted loyal administrators or the pope who wanted obedient churchmen, produced some of the most dramatic conflicts of the period. But for the purposes of understanding the hierarchy as a structure, the key point is simple. The bishop sat in both worlds at once, and the obligations of both worlds fell on him simultaneously. The underlying ideology that made sense of all of this, that gave medieval society a story about itself that it found coherent, was articulated by a bishop named Adalbero of Leon around the year 1000, and simultaneously in England by a churchman named Elfric of Eynsham. The idea is known to historians by the Latin phrase those who pray, those who fight, those who work, oratores, bellatores, laboratores. Three orders, each with a distinct function, each necessary to the whole, each dependent on the other two. The clergy prayed, and their prayers maintained the spiritual health of Christendom. The warriors fought, and their fighting maintained the physical safety of Christendom. The workers laboured, and their labour fed both the others. In this model, no one was dispensable, and the hierarchy was not an arbitrary imposition, but a divinely ordered distribution of necessary functions. It was, of course, a story that benefited enormously those who wrote it down and those whose position it most easily justified. But it was also a story that gave the person at the bottom of the pile a way of understanding his position that was not simply defeat. Your labor was necessary. Your labor sustained the prayers and the swords that in turn sustained you. You were not a residue at the base of a structure that had no use for you. You were one of three essential things, and the church, more than any other part of this entire system, offered something the three orders model did not quite account for: actual mobility. A ploughman's son who showed intelligence could enter minor orders, could be educated at a monastery school or a cathedral school, could rise through the ecclesiastical ranks as far as his abilities and his connections, and a certain amount of fortune would carry him. In principle, the ladder extended from the lowest village church to the papacy itself, and there were popes who came from origins far humbler than the baronage. The church was the one institution in the medieval world where birth was not the final word, where the question of what you owed and to whom could be answered in Latin rather than in livestock, where the currency of advancement was learning and loyalty to an institution that recognized talent as a form of divine gift. Now let us climb to the very top. Because all of this, the serf's weak work and the knight's destrier and the baron's relief and the bishop's dual allegiances, converges in the figure of the king. And the king's position is both the apex of the pyramid and the most peculiar position on it, because while everyone below holds of someone above, the king, in the logic of the system, holds of no man, he holds of God. The king's income came from sources so varied and so layered that understanding them is understanding how power actually functioned in the medieval world. The royal domain was first the king's own estates, vast collections of manors and forests and boroughs spread across the kingdom, generating rents and agricultural income just as any lord's manors did, only on a scale that dwarfed any single baron. A significant fraction of England's agricultural land in the 11th and 12th centuries was royal domain, and managing it was a permanent enterprise requiring its own administrative apparatus. Beyond the domain came the feudal incidents, the same logic that bound the baron to pay relief when he inherited, that gave the king wardship over a minor heir, that made the marriage of an heiress a royal asset, operated at the very top of the pyramid with the greatest leverage. Every baron who died leaving an heir paid relief. Every barony whose heir was a child brought the king wardship. Every wealthy heiress whose marriage was unsettled was a saleable asset. Multiplied across dozens of baronies, these incidents generated a continuous stream of irregular but substantial revenue, and the temptation to exploit them was enormous because there was no one above the king to restrain him, only the accumulated weight of custom and the always present risk that pushed beyond a certain point, the barons would push back collectively, which is precisely what produced Magna Carta. Scutage, the payment a vassal made instead of performing his military service in person, had developed by the 12th century into a tool of royal finance as much as a military convenience. Many knights and many barons preferred to pay cash, and the king often preferred cash because cash could be used to hire professional soldiers, trained men who fought for wages, and could be deployed without the complexity and slowness of the feudal summons. The transition from the feudal levy to the paid military was one of the long, gradual transformations of the medieval centuries, and scutage was one of the mechanisms driving it. The wool custom was another great engine of royal income, though it belonged to a later period of the machinery. England's economy in the high medieval centuries was built substantially on wool. English sheep produced a product of such quality that Flemish and Italian weavers would pay handsomely for it. and the wool trade moved enormous quantities of wealth through English ports. A tax levied on wool exports produced, in the right years, revenue that dwarfed what could be extracted from the land directly, and the management of the wool custom became one of the central preoccupations of English royal finance from the 13th century onward. It was in the context of the wool trade that figures like William de la Pole, the great Hull merchant whose wealth came from the export trade, rose to lend money directly to the crown, and whose descendants received the kind of elevation that had previously required land and blood rather than capital. There was another source of royal revenue that does not appear in the comfortable accounts of the feudal system, the jury. Jewish communities in medieval England occupied a peculiar and precarious legal position. They were, in the strict definition of English law, the king's own, his property, and his to dispose of as he wished. This gave them a limited kind of protection because harming them was harming the king's assets, but it also meant that the king could tax them at will, a power called tallage in this context, levied at the king's discretion and without the process that constrained other forms of taxation. Jewish moneylenders, who occupied the lending market because Christian doctrine's prohibition on usury restricted Christian involvement, accumulated capital that the king then periodically extracted through tallage. The arrangement was exploitative by design, and it ended in 1290 when Edward I expelled the entire Jewish community from England, having by that point extracted so much that there was little further value to extract, and finding that resentment and the opportunity for seizure of debts made expulsion the calculation he chose to make. The profits of justice were also a significant part of royal income, and this is a feature of medieval royal finance that seems strange to modern eyes. The king's peace was a concept that had economic consequences. Crimes committed against the king's peace, that is, crimes of violence and disorder that disturbed the social order the king guaranteed, resulted in fines paid to the crown. The court system was, among other things, a revenue mechanism. Fines for offences, amercements imposed on those who failed to appear in court or who brought unsuccessful pleas, the various fees associated with royal writs and legal processes, all of this generated a continuous flow of income to the crown. Justice was not free and the profits of dispensing it were real. Parliamentary taxation, the occasional grant of a fraction of assessed lay wealth, the 15th and 10th as it was known in the later medieval period, required the consent of the representatives assembled in Parliament, and this is where the line between royal prerogative and negotiated obligation was always under pressure. The king could raise the feudal incidents from his tenants-in-chief without asking. He could draw the revenues of his domain without asking. He could levy the wool custom within limits, but a general tax on the broader population of the kingdom required consent, and the machinery of consent was Parliament, which was itself the institutional expression of the same principle that ran through the entire hierarchy. Obligation must be named and agreed, not simply asserted. The machinery for keeping track of all of this was remarkable and has left the longest continuous financial record in Europe. The Exchequer was the institution that audited the crown's accounts, received the revenues, and produced the records. It takes its name from something entirely literal. The table around which the king's financial officers sat was covered with a checkered cloth, black and white squares laid out in rows and columns, and the accountants moved metal counters across the squares to perform their calculations. It was an abacus built into a tablecloth, a physical aid to arithmetic in an age before Hindu-Arabic numerals were fully established in English administrative practice. The squares represented columns of value, ones and tens and hundreds and thousands, and a counter in a square meant that much currency in that column. Moving counters was calculating. The checkered cloth was the calculating machine. The document that describes all of this in detail, a text written around the year 1179 by Richard Fitz-Neal, who was at the time the Treasurer of England, is called the Dialogus Discacario, the dialogue concerning the Exchequer. It is written as a conversation between a master and a pupil, explaining the procedures and customs of the institution, and it is a remarkable window into the administrative mind of the 12th century, precise and practical and thorough, concerned with how the numbers work and what the procedures mean, and what to do when the normal case does not apply. The word exchequer, from that checkered cloth, eventually gave the English language the title Chancellor of the Exchequer, which persists into the present as the name of the minister responsible for national finance, a linguistic trace of a table covered in black and white squares in the 12th century. The records that document royal income are called the pipe rolls, a name derived from the cylindrical shape of the rolled parchments when stored. They begin in 1130, an isolated survivor from the reign of Henry I, and then continue unbroken from 1155, making them the longest continuous financial archive in European history. These are not dramatic documents. They are columns of numbers and abbreviated Latin, recording what each sheriff of each county owed the crown for the year, what he had paid, and what remained outstanding. They are the accounting of the kingdom, and they survive because record-keeping was itself a form of power. To write down what was owed was to assert the right to collect it. The king himself did not sit still while this administration worked around him. For most of the medieval period, the English king had no fixed capital in the modern sense. London was growing in importance, and Winchester had been the administrative centre of the Anglo-Saxon kings, but the crown's actual governance was peripatetic, the king and his court moving from place to place across the kingdom in a continuous circuit, never staying in one location long enough to exhaust what was available. This movement had a practical economic dimension that the dry word purveyance conveys. The crown held the right to requisition supplies at fixed prices, to demand food and transport and accommodation from the areas through which it moved, paying the set rate rather than the market rate, which was frequently lower. A king and his court and his entourage represented a very large number of people to feed and house, and the obligation to provide for them at below-market prices was deeply resented by those in the court's path, and yet it was an integral part of how the royal household fed itself and moved. The travelling king was both a practical reality and a political one. By moving through the kingdom, he was also asserting his presence, his authority, his actuality as a ruler, rather than a distant figure known only through his officials. The court circuit was a way of making the crown visible in every corner of the realm, and the requirement of hospitality that fell on the magnates in whose great houses the court sometimes rested was simultaneously an honour and an imposition. And now, having climbed the entire length of this structure, from the strip of soil your grandfather farmed on the domain's edge, to the king moving across his kingdom with his courts and his exchequer, and his pipe rolls and his checkered tablecloth doing arithmetic, from the heriot of your best cow to the relief of an entire barony, from the hand quern confiscated by the abbot to the wool custom flowing through the ports to the royal treasury, it is time to say what has been accumulating as the true shape of the whole thing. Every rung of this structure, without exception, was organized around the same three-part transaction. You held something from the person above you. You owed that person something specific and named in return for it, and you had sworn loyalty to seal the arrangement. Those three threads, land and labor and loyalty, ran from the base to the very apex without a break, and only the currency changed. The serf held his strips from the lord and owed week work and merchet and heriot and tallage. The free tenant held his virgate from the lord and owed rent and suit of court. The knight held his fee from the baron and owed 40 days and homage and fealty. The baron held his barony from the king and owed his servitium, debitum, and attendance and relief. The bishop held his episcopal lands from the king and owed knight service and the tithe and frankelmoin, the special form of tenure by which the church held land in exchange for prayers. The parish priest held his glebe from the church and owed his office's duties and a mortuary at his death. Even the king, at the very top, holding of no human lord, held within the theological frame from God and owed prayer and justice and the protection of the church, which is why the coronation was a sacrament and the crown's authority was framed as divine appointment. The serf surrendering his best ox at his father's death and the baron paying relief to inherit his barony were performing the same act at different scales. Both were acknowledging that the land was not truly theirs in absolute terms. Both were paying the cost of succession to whoever held the rung above. The sweat at the base of the pyramid and the gold at the top were different measures of the same underlying obligation. Even the currency changed in a way that tells you something about the hierarchy. At the bottom, the payment was labor itself, the raw expenditure of bodily time on another man's land. Moving up, but was translated into produce, then into livestock, then into cash. And at the very top, the currency was military service, knights in the field, armored and mounted. The farther up you went, the more the obligation was abstracted from physical labor, the more it was denominated in symbols of power rather than in the sweat that actually made the land productive. But the logic was identical throughout, and within this structure that looks from a distance as rigid and fixed as the stones of a cathedral, there were always the cracks through which movement was possible. Town air could make you free if you lasted a year and a day inside the walls without being reclaimed. The church could elevate you from the village to the highest offices in Christendom if you had the learning and the favor. Scutage could turn a military obligation into a cash transaction, loosening the personal bond between lord and vassal. The merchant with enough capital could lend to kings and watch his descendants receive the dignity that had once belonged only to those who held land by blood. The reeve who managed the lord's estate with skill could accumulate small advantages, a little land here, a reduction in dues there, a position of informal power that shaded into something that looked less like bondage and more like agency. The pyramid was not a prison without exits. It was a structure whose exits were small and difficult and required specific conditions, but they existed and people found them, and over the long centuries the structure itself changed gradually under the accumulated pressure of those who moved through it and around it and sometimes against it. The Black Death in the 14th century accelerated what the logic of labor scarcity had been building for some time. The collapse of week work as the primary form of serf obligation, the commutation of labor services into money rents, the loosening of villain status as lords found they needed to offer better terms to keep workers on the land. The great structures of the medieval hierarchy were not eternal. They were solutions to particular problems in particular conditions, and when the conditions changed, the solutions changed with them. But on a calm night in the middle of the 12th century or the 13th, the structure was there, solid and apparently permanent, ordering every life within it from the smallest cotter with his few acres to the greatest baron with his dozens of manors, with the church running its own parallel ascent alongside, and the king moving across the face of it all. Every person in it knew with great specificity what they owed, to whom they owed it, and on what occasions the payment fell due. The system of names for everything, merchant, heriot, relief, scutage, tallage, multure, glebe, tithe, homage, fealty, servitium, debitum, was not bureaucratic excess. It was precision. To name the obligation was to make it legible, to make it predictable, to make it something that could be anticipated and prepared for, and, where possible, negotiated. There is something almost restful in that specificity at this distance. The medieval world, for all its hardship, was a world in which the terms of your existence were known. The price of your daughter's marriage was named. The price of inheriting your father's barony was named. The day your strip was to be ploughed, and the day the multure fell due, and the day the boon harvest called you to the domain were all legible within the turning year. The uncertainty was different in kind from our own, not the uncertainty of formless modern anxiety, but the uncertainty of weather and harvest and plague, the natural world's refusal to keep to the schedule the human world had laid over it. In the long view, looking back across the centuries from the quiet of a late evening, the medieval hierarchy looks like what it was: a vast, improvised answer to the problem of organizing a world without most of the tools we would reach for now, without the market mechanisms that would eventually displace it, without the state capacity that would eventually replace the Lord's court and the church's tithe with something more uniform, without the individual rights that would eventually make the idea of a man being transferred with a manor seem not merely unfair, but unthinkable. It was the world that was, and the people who lived inside it were not abstractions or figures in a diagram, but individuals, with their names recorded in the court rolls and the pipe rolls and the tithe accounts and the guild ordinances, their best cows listed in the heriots, their daughters' marriages noted in the merchant records, their journeyman wages set out in the guild accounts, their relief payments entered in the Exchequer's chequered reckoning. The serf who had to surrender that cow knew what the cow meant. The knight who knelt and placed his hands between his lords and swore fealty on the Gospels felt the weight of that moment. The apprentice who spent 7 years in a master's house to earn the right to make his masterpiece and stand for judgment before the guild knew what it had cost him. The merchant who lent money to the crown and watched his descendants become dukes in the generation after him knew something about the difference between the world his grandfather had inhabited and the world his grandchildren would inherit. They were people inside a structure, doing what people inside structures always do, finding the rules, learning the exits, paying the price when there was no alternative, pressing the limits when there was. The pyramid held until it did not, and then it was replaced by another arrangement with its own named obligations and its own hierarchy and its own ways of distributing land and labor and loyalty, only called by different names. The checkered cloth is gone. The Exchequer remains in name. The court rolls sleep in their archives. The tithe barns still stand here and there in the English countryside, enormous and stone-built, outlasting the obligation they once housed. And somewhere beneath the ploughed fields of England, the celions of the open field system are still faintly visible from the air, the ghost of a landscape organized by a logic that has not operated for centuries but has not entirely disappeared, the way a habit leaves a trace in the body even after the body has stopped performing it. Let all of that settle now, slowly. The king on the road with his court and his carts and his checkered tablecloth. The baron at his hall with his relief paid and his night service counted. The knight in his hall with his destrier in the stable and his homage sworn. The merchant with his masterpiece behind him and his journeyman in his workshop. The reeve standing between the lord's interests and his neighbours, threading that needle every day. The alewife with her assize-regulated brew cooling in the vat. The serf in his strips watching the third field lie fallow, knowing when the boon harvest will call him to the domain and what he will owe at every turning of the year. And the parish priest in his glebe, and the monk in his cloister, and the bishop in his cathedral, holding his two obligations simultaneously, secular and sacred, and the great wheel of obligation turning from cottage to crown, and back again, land and labour and loyalty knotted in every hand at every rung, the same contract written at different sizes all the way up. That is the structure. That is the life at every level of a medieval kingdom. Nothing left to do now but be calm and drift.